what we're doing is we're trying to compare our modern upbringing, our modern forms of schooling, our modern forms of processing information, and we're saying this is really remarkable to me, therefore it must have really been remarkable to them too, even though they're coming from a culture where memory is specifically trained, where memory is a big deal in their it's one of the basis of their entire school system. So that's one thing we want to be careful of when we look at people from a whole nother place in time. um, we've got to be careful on saying what we believe or don't believe from our own experience must be what's going on there.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. This is part 2 of my interview with scholar and author of the book Visions in a Seer Stone, William Davis. William, thank you for coming back for part 2.
Yeah, this is fun.
It has been really fun. I really enjoyed. So part 1, we talked about a little bit about your sort of like background with the church, your scholarships, what led you to writing your book, Visions in a Seer Stone. We talked a little about sort of like your theory for how Joseph Smith either translated or dictated the Book of Mormon using this laying down heads technique, similar to like a Methodist preacher, and it was quite a common sermon style and also writing style in the 19th century. So we talked about your view of like the dictation, and we talked about like lots of different things. I can't even remember half the things that we talked about. What else did we talk about in the last part?
I don't know. We kind of bounced around a little bit. Just uh
We're,
just
we're not
details
very good at
about that
laying down heads for
process.
what we talked about. Yeah.
No.
But go back in part 1. It was really good. Part 2, what I'm hoping to do is to ask more questions, either maybe challenging your theory, so like maybe some apologetic arguments, and to ask for your thoughts on maybe different either translation theories or different critical theories as well, and just any other insights that you want to share about your theory for composition or translation that we didn't talk about in part 1, you could include in this part as well.
Okay.
All right. Okay, let's see where to start. So I don't think you talk too much about this in your book. You probably touch on it, but I know you've done an article on this. But there's a bit of, I would say, controversy over Joe Smith's level of education. So whenever
Mm.
I've had Brian Hales on and have read what other apologists or sort of more faithful scholars have said on the topic, they said that Joe Smith wasn't that well educated, maybe had like a third grade level of education. And they say that, his mother said that he wasn't as interested in the reading of books. I think in his own history, he says that he could read and he knew like basic arithmetic and stuff. But they're basically saying that he wasn't this really well educated genius who was reading loads of books. And, Brian Hales or others might make the argument that there doesn't seem to be evidence that he's this like literary genius or has all these composition skills. What would be your response to his level of education? How much education do you believe he might have had? And also like the argument about like, did he have the oratory, composition, literary skills for this?
Okay. That's actually a lot of questions.
Sorry. Why don't we
It's
talk about the
okay.
education first? Talk about that, the
Okay,
level
so
of education.
the first thing, it's really, really common to hear people say, well, he probably only had about a third grade education. And so one thing I haven't done it recently, excuse me, but I thought, where is that idea coming from? Who was the first person to say Joseph Smith only had a third grade education? Now, I haven't found the original quote, but it does go back a long time. It's kind of one of those things that's entered into just the atmosphere of Mormon studies or Mormon cultural thought that Joseph Smith just had this third grade education. But
I
every
have to
time,
translate that into my own education system here, which is like year 4, I think. So like, is that kind of like an 8-year-old sort of equivalent education or?
yeah, I mean, 5, 6, 7, yeah, about an 8-year old.
Okay.
And but the thing that I found out in doing this and in interacting with people who are making that claim is whenever you say, okay, how did you come to that number? Why not fourth grade? Why not second grade? And to date, no one has actually been able to break that down. It's just this figure that someone said and everybody else starts repeating it. Excuse me. And we don't know where that came from.
I don't know where that came from.
And so there are a lot of problems with saying that. The first thing is, and maybe it's just Joseph Smith saying I was just instructed in reading, writing, arithmetic, and that's all the education I had. Although that would contradict the Orsamus Turner, who said that I think it's Orsamus who said that he joined a juvenile debate society because that's certainly well beyond a third grade
Mhm.
education level to be doing that. That's the sort of thing that someone joined and participated once they finished the common school curriculum and wanted to go further in self-improvement. Um, so I don't know where it's coming from. But I will, it's part of the problem is like just now when you said, if I were to equate this to the level of education where you'd be in the year four or whatever, that that comparison right away is where a lot of people get into serious trouble. And that's because the way that a third grade level of education in America today you don't have the equivalent back then,
Right.
except in the most general topics like learning how to read, learning your alphabet, learning the basics of arithmetic. So some of the material, it's like one of those Venn diagrams where there's a little bit of overlap in terms of the types of things they learned, but there's a lot of stuff that does not overlap.
Hmm.
And they're crucial. And so if someone there's a problem in historical research called presentism. Sorry, this thing is moving around. Presentism is when we try to understand the past when we're referencing our current practices today. So someone will think, well, I learned reading and writing in this between the third grade, therefore that's the equivalent for Joseph. We're kind of projecting our own modern experience onto the past, not realizing that what was actually happening in the past was very different from what we're assuming. So anyway, try to be direct about this. It's a logical fallacy to say he had the equivalent of third grade education because they're not comparable except on the most thin level of topics. And so overall, fundamentally, the pedagogical approach, the pedagogy, and I'm sure you've run across that in your own field, but for it's one of those big words, and it simply is the way you go about teaching. It's
Hmm.
how to instruct. Today, when children are going through school, it is a text-based system that we have. So if a child's learning how to read, a lot of times it's just silent reading. Or if you're today, people have said, oh, these are the types of vocabulary words that someone should learn in the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. And so they tailor reading materials based upon these models. That is all new. There was nothing like that back at that time. There's uh, and the way that you learned, like math, for example, if you want to do math, you usually, okay, here's your multiplication tables. And so kids take their pencils and they take their piece of paper and they go and they fill it in. You go back in time, and how were those things taught? Well, math was oral. So you would learn these things from a teacher and using a book, but the way that you were quizzed is that you had to suddenly stand up and the teacher starts peppering you with questions and you have to on the spot extemporaneously start answering these questions. And so what's going on in the schools back at that time is it's not written based. The whole teaching instruction was all revolving around orality, oral performance.
Mm.
Let me give you an example of what that's like. So when we say today, I'm going to teach you how to read. All right. So kids will just start learning the letters and stuff. I don't even know. I mean, I'm so far removed from it. I don't even know when kids are taught what a comma is or what a period is or a semicolon. Um, it's just kind of there in the text as they're learning how to read. Um, but when you're actually, I don't even know when that is, but it's certainly, I wasn't ever taught anything like that in probably third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade. I mean, those were just things that were kind of there to create sentences. Now,
I
the
know now
difference is,
school over here they sort of teach grammar more and punctuation specifically as part of English, but I was the same whenever I grew up. I don't really remember learning a
yeah.
lot of those things.
So that's kind of the modern way it was taught. Now, if we were to go back into Joseph Smith's classroom, common rule schoolroom, totally different approach because it's an oral approach. Now, what happens is when kids are learning how to read, they would have to read out loud because part of the preparation of learning how to read was also to be able to read aloud to other people because that was training people on how to speak because ultimately and if you wanted to have a good career as a lawyer or as a public servant or something else you had to be able to perform, you had to be able to speak in front of a group, and so
Right.
learning how to read was also learning teaching skills on how eventually to perform speaking in public. And one of the ways that they did that, they had this phrase when they were reading out loud, they would call mind your points. Do most people know what that phrase even means today? That was like one of the most common phrases that teachers would say to their students. And that's mind the points. Points was kind of an older word for punctuation. And so what happened is when they're reading out loud, they were taught something that like today, when someone's taught punctuation or grammar, that is something that is just how to diagram a sentence or how to write a proper written sentence. Back then, in the common school classrooms especially, punctuation was known as rhetorical punctuation. And what that means is punctuation was kind of a notation giving children hints on how they should read aloud. So a comma meant you're supposed to pause for a certain breath or two. A semicolon, you would pause longer. And a period was what they called a full stop. And so they were trained on looking at the punctuation. So it was not so much about grammar as much as teaching kids on how to speak phrases, how to pause between phrases, and then they were also
Mhm.
taught not just simply how to speak out loud in ways that made sense. And that's why they say mind your points, because if a kid spoke and then halfway through a sentence or a phrase, they stopped and took a breath and then started again, it kind of breaks up the meaning. It's confusing for the listener. And so when they say mind your points, it's pay attention to the punctuation. That's where you're going to do your stops. And that's another reason why when you look at some of these early writings, especially not so much the newspapers, because they were forming a more standardized approach to punctuation. But even then, in Joseph Smith's time, you'll have people writing letters, and in their mind, especially if they're trained in common school and not much further, um, you're not going to see a lot of punctuation, if any, because punctuation is not setting up the grammar on the letter. Punctuation is a notation on how to speak this. And if you're writing a letter and you're not going to be reading it aloud to the person receiving it, all you're doing is putting in your performance notations for them. That's the concept of rhetorical grammar. And
Mhm.
so kids are learning grammar as performance notation, there's nothing like that going on with modern schools. And then not only that, they were also taught on how to modulate their voices. Don't speak monotone. And you'll see accounts of the early schools when kids are first starting and this droning and monotone. It's awful. But as the kids got older, you were being taught on how to gesture properly when you're speaking, how to not have monotone, but use different layers of loudness, when to speak softly, when to tap into emotions, when to be stern, and children in common schools, by the time they'd been through a few years of that, and there's accounts of this, where common school children would go to see a public speaker give a Fourth of July address, and they would be kind of critical about, oh, he didn't pause long enough there. He's a little bit monotone here. He needs a little more variation and kids. And where do we learn that today in
Not
grammar
really
school?
part of it.
You don't. And so, and the other thing too is a big thing is memory. Oh, they were taught memory in ways that modern kids would just freak out because we've got our phones. We don't need to memorize a lot. If we need information on something, boom, boom, just on the web and you got your answer. But back then, a big part of training people and their education was training memory. And so what they would have also, apart from just speaking this out loud, part of that was preparation for what they would call recitation days or their exhibitions. They didn't have grades back then. So it's not like, oh, in his math, he gets an A, and in his introduction to reading, he gets a B. There was nothing like that. What they would do is that at the end of the school year, the children, and depending on how many children there were in the school district, would depend on whether or not they selected the best students or if everyone participated. But what they would do is a student would get up and would have to recite a speech in front of the crowd. And that was their final testing. And it was also the testing for the teacher because a lot of the parents, the only way that they could determine whether or not their child was being taught properly is whether or not, they could perform literally in front of people.
And
And
it was pretty
so
much like reciting the speech from memory.
yes, yes, never reading it. So what would happen is exhibition day at the end of the term, the teachers there, all the parents and the family members come, and then local dignitaries. You'll have, the preachers from the local churches. You'll have, the town mayor, the school board trustees. Everybody shows up. So a lot of pressure. It's a big deal. It's kind of a celebratory time too. And then the kids would get up, and the children would be reciting, old Greek classic speeches or something from some recent Patrick Henry speech. And then students would also be doing dialogues. So two students would get up and they'd go back and forth, and all of these, and so they're memorizing all of it's like little actors. They're all been turned into little actors. But it wasn't just with the reading material, it was also with math. It was also with geography. So a child would stand up and they have no idea what's going to happen. So you got to be prepared. You got to be able to speak extemporaneously on the moment. You got to know, because then they'll say, okay, tell us about England. Tell us about the history. What's their economics? Tell us, list out you had to know their history. So tell us the last 10 kings of England and when they lived, because that's part of knowing your history of England. Or if it's, math, then, here's this. Give us the solution to this equation or do this division. And so this was a really intense oral based culture.
Mm.
And the texts that they were using, uh, kids from the very beginning, I mean, how many common schools teach their children how to read by reading the New Testament and memorizing New Testament passages? Today we'd say this is a little bit beyond their reading level. Let's save it. And it's also religious, and we're trying to keep things, but back then the New Testament was one of the most popular texts used for people reading. And then there were some other super popular readers as well that that when you look at the material, and this is another thing, when you look at Lindley Murray was an American who eventually he kind of lived back and forth between America and England, but he had this extremely wildly popular reader that was used actually in the schools, in the common schools in Palmyra and Manchester and in that area. And when you go through and you look at what were the children reading in the common schools, these aren't pieces that are tailored to children. These are excerpts from sermons, from the popular magazine Addison Spectator. These are snippets of advanced adult reading that were put together in a reader that children were reading, and not just reading, but memorizing and reciting.
Hmm.
So they were working with
That's
reading
quite high
material.
level education.
Yeah. And when people, I think what happens is when people think back to the schoolhouses, there's this, oh, it must have been just super simple. They taught them how to do their alphabet. They barely learned how to read, and then they learned some addition. That's it. They were out the door. That is not true at all. And then when you also get to the point where when the Smith family was living in Manchester and also in Palmyra, that first wave of kind of frontier settlement had already passed. Not, it wasn't long in the past, but it had passed, and you had a lot of people flooding in there, not just because you had the Erie Canal that was going to be built, but just below them in Canandaigua, which is, a few miles south of the Smith family farm. There was the major trade artery for commerce went right through Canandaigua from Albany over to Rochester and Buffalo. That was the main thoroughfare for any type of overland movement of any kind of commerce, any types of goods, any types of the services. So there was this was not Joseph Smith way off in some tiny backwards, totally cut off from everybody. They were right in the middle where everything was really starting to bloom and blossom. The initial frontierism had kind of swept out and it was more over to, Ohio and the Mississippi Valley was when they were starting to rebuild. But this was established, and these even though people were moving through constantly, there was a lot more advanced teaching going on in those common schools than just the generalized descriptions you have of the frontier where they're just breaking ground.
Right,
So
okay.
anyway, this is all to say that when someone says Joseph Smith's education was only about a third grade level, that is a false equivalency. You can't do it. You can, like, again, that Venn diagram, there are some topics that they learned in common, but the way they were taught them and how they were instructed were worlds apart, and it developed an entirely different skill set among students back then in terms of skill and oral performance and memory and being able to, I mean, the memory skills out of this world, out of this world. And not just the common schools. Joseph Smith also attended a Sunday school, and I haven't looked at the information here recently. But the Sunday schools at the time that Joseph Smith was attending Sunday school, this was another area of education. Oh my gosh, there's too many things to talk about. One thing too is today when we think about I'm going to go get an education, well, where do you go? I go to school, and that's where I get my education. That's not how it was back then. When children went to get an education back in the time period when things were still building up and when the education system wasn't fully there was this massive culture of self-improvement. You had domestic education going on, not the same as homeschooling. Domestic education was where the parents took responsibility to help instruct students in the same types of lessons that were taking place in the common schools. So you had domestic education. And if you had limitations because you were poor, like the Smiths, and you couldn't really move up in the world, then you would get together with other people and you start building these juvenile debate and literary societies, which were massively popular all over the place. Then you also at the Sunday schools. The Sunday school was another place where they were teaching children how to read, and it really had a religious focus because the whole purpose is you want to teach them how to read so that they can eventually read the Bible, and it's also a way of instilling good morals into the children. So children were getting an education from several different venues, and it's very different from today when we just kind of imagine someone going to the school and coming home and that's it.
Right.
Anyway, going back to memory, it's astonishing when you go back into the history book. When I first started reading this, I thought, "Oh wow, this boggles my mind." Um, a lot of the Sunday schools would start sending in reports about what their children were doing, and because they want people to instill the scriptures in their hearts, they felt that the way to do that is you instill a lesson by having them memorize scriptures that teach that lesson. So, if you want to learn about, honesty, you go get a bunch of scriptures about honesty and that you have the children learn that. Well, then that started turning into these kind of competitions of, if you can memorize one or two scriptures a week, why don't you memorize five? Why don't you memorize 10? And then pretty soon there were these competitions among students about memorizing Sunday school verses. And so all these Sunday school reports were coming in saying the entire class altogether memorized 1,232 verses. But that doesn't give you the details about how much each student did. But then they'll start pointing to some of the standouts. Because what would happen is this, if a child were to receive special recognition, oftentimes if they won an award, then they would be given a book, or they'd be given their own set of scriptures, or they'd be given some copy of a religious work. Really popular ones, for example, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, super popular to give away as a prize. But then when they start describing what these children were doing, I mean, there's one I remember offhand where there was a child who was a member of the Sunday school. He was also working full time. He was only about 14 or 15 years old. And in a period of about a month and a half or 2 months, when they came in to do the recitation test to see who did the best, he had the entire book of Mark memorized.
Wow.
And
That's
that's
amazing.
another thing that we have to be careful about that. So when we're talking about historical research, one of the things that historians are trained to do is to constantly recognize if their modern viewpoint or biases or expectations are somehow getting projected on the past, because that will prevent us from seeing what was going on there. And that's why they call it presentism. What I experience in the present must be what they experienced in the past. But back then, memory was a huge deal.
Okay, so
Uh,
so with that in mind, I have a question. Well, I've got a couple of questions, but one you're saying with memory, in the school system in Sunday school, they could have memorized passages of the Bible, even long passages.
oh yeah.
Throughout the Book of Mormon, we see both. You've got Old Testament passages, you got like the Isaiah chapters, which Nephi's claiming he's quoting from the brass plates. There seems to be a dependence on the King James Bible, maybe not word for word. There's maybe some changes made, like interacting with the italics. You've got like the Sermon at the Temple that's very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. But then you've also got other passages, for example, like Moroni 7 or Moroni 10. Moroni 7,
Mhm.
Moroni's given a sermon on charity, which is nearly sort of word for word of what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13. I think the gifts of the Spirit in Moroni 10 is very similar to Paul. So my question is, because you could view this is translation in Joseph's language and vocabulary. In your theory, is Joseph consulting a King James Bible? Be it naturalistically or not, or do you believe that he would have those passages memorized? Because I know there's lots of like little phrases scattered throughout the Book of Mormon, but when it comes to like the longer passages, do you see that as coming from Joseph's memory or likely consulting a King James Bible?
I would say when it comes to the Isaiah passages that he is consulting a Bible.
Hmm.
And I think when people try to point to Emma Smith or David Whitmer saying he had no notes or manuscripts, that there are several problems with that. One of them is when you go back and look at the actual full context of where they said those things, the introduction leading up to those quotes is where they're trying to say, no, Sidney Rigdon didn't bring Spalding's manuscript. No, there wasn't any other kind of manuscript here that he was copying. This was something that just was coming from God, this translation. They're not talking about whether or not there was a Bible at the side. And Joseph says, you know what? Nephi's quoting Isaiah. Let's look at it. But then being inspired to say, we need to make adjustments along the way. I think there was a Bible used. And I think that when people try to use Emma's statement and David Whitmer's statement to deny it, that what they're doing is they're Emma and David are talking about a very specific thing. Spalding's manuscript or any other romance or manuscript that Joseph Smith was trying to copy in that moment. And that when they say, oh, it also includes the Bible, then they're stretching the meaning of the context of what they're taking that out of context and trying to apply it to any and every other kind of any potential writing of any other sort of any kind. So that's one of the problems because we're dealing with something that's a logical fallacy of overgeneralization. Another thing that is also overgeneralization is when Emma made that statement, she's saying, if it's not when, but it's the same meaning. She said, when I was writing for your father, this is what it was like. And so you have to say, when was Emma acting as a scribe? Now, if Emma was the scribe from start to finish, that would make a stronger case. But Emma, the only document evidence that we can have is Emma describing the time when she was working on the lost 116 pages. And then when Oliver Cowdery comes into the scene, he becomes the dominant scribe. There's still some other people who come on, but of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, we don't have Emma's handwriting in there anywhere. But there's only like what 28% of it, so maybe she was somewhere. But then you think, okay, first of all, was Isaiah being quoted by Nephi in the 116 pages? We don't know that. And in fact, probably not, because when Mormon is talking about how he took these smaller plates of Nephi that were just filled with the spiritual writings instead of the large plates, which was more of a history, that replacement is where we find Isaiah. Well, when was the dictation of First and Nephi, well, Second Nephi, really taking place? Well,
Towards
that
the
was
end.
at the end. Emma's out of the picture at that point in terms of being a scribe. Maybe she came in briefly at some point, but what's happening is people are saying, and it's the same with David Whitmer. David Whitmer said, "Yeah, I observed this. I was frequently there." And we know this because he had an interview with a person at a newspaper, and then they came back and they printed their story, David's story about what was going on. They say David Whitmer says that no notes, and that's the first time I think when they have mention of notes. Emma
Yeah,
doesn't mention notes,
right.
but he said there were no notes, there were no manuscripts, there was no other romance that Joseph was copying. But then they said, and he would know because he was there for all of it. And David Whitmer wrote back a letter to the newspaper editor, and he said, "Hold on, I was present a lot, but I wasn't there every single session, just to be clear." And so what's happening is it's very unlikely that if Joseph Smith were referencing a Bible, that Emma would have even been present to witness that. David Whitmer, it would depend on was he there that day or not. And when you look at if Joseph Smith takes a copy of the Bible and he's reading from it and then making inspired changes along the way, how much time, how many sessions would that be that someone could have witnessed this happening? And it's not very many. So so what's happening is people say, well, Emma said it was like this for her when she did it, therefore it must have been the same for every other day when every other scribe did it. And that is a fallacy of thinking. I mean, that's like me saying, for the first 3 days when I drove out of my house, I saw the ice cream truck go by. So I guess the ice cream truck goes by every other day, even when I'm not out there to see it. It's a real bad assumption.
Okay.
And, and so anyway,
And
yeah,
and the smaller phrases in the
oh
Book of Mormon, because whenever I
yeah,
interviewed Dan Vogel, Dan Vogel believes Joseph was spoke sort of fluent Bible, even if it's not always word for word, but he was kind of talking in King James Bible language. And of course, you could interpret some of those passages either as coming under more of a translation and Joseph rendering the translation in King James Bible language. Maybe it's somewhat similar to what was on the plates, or you could view it as Joe Smith as the author orally dictating. Do you see some of the, not the chapters of Isaiah or necessarily like the Sermon at the Temple, but maybe other passages which are quoted in the Book of Mormon that this is likely Joseph being able to recite from memory passages
yeah,
from the Bible, particularly New Testament phrases or passages that are a little bit
mhm.
longer?
Yeah, the one you mentioned about the passage on charity,
Yeah,
that to me, because if you compare those two passages, there are a couple of key omissions. And when something drops out, when he's listed, if you have charity this, charity that, charity the other, there's a couple of just places that completely drop out. Yet the rest of the passage is clearly structurally, the integrity of it is based upon the rendering in the King James
yeah,
version of the Bible. And so that is the sort of thing that lets you know uh, that this is a memorial reconstruction. And when you look into the opening of the passage and how it gets woven in, it's not just the story of the Book of Mormon, they'll some boing, this New Testament, and then boing back to the story of the Book of Mormon. It's woven into that
yeah.
passage.
Hmm.
And so it just kind of the New Testament emerges and then goes back in to the text.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's
That
just a plagiarize, like plagiarizing from the text, copy and paste. It's kind of like
yeah.
woven into the dictation. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I have real problems when people talk about plagiarism, because that whether or not something's plagiarized, you have to know a person's motive behind it for one, and then our conception of what plagiarism is today is very similar to then, but not entirely the same. But we can come back to that. Um, anyway, the that to me is a moment where that is a passage that looks like it was something that had been memorized, internalized, and then in the course of dictating the text, the messages or whatever were so similar to this New Testament passage that all of that New Testament language and background broke into it and
Right.
then went back out.
Okay.
And I'm going to mention something about that as well, because people will say, oh, Hugh Nibley said that this entire passage actually predated Paul, and it was way back there in some ancient shared source, and that
I think I've heard that argument.
yeah, and that's not a good argument because you go back and you look at the information that he was drawing from, and it's later at the very end. He's not the scholarship that Hugh Nibley cited was not about that part of the chapter. It's the very tail end, faith, hope, and charity, that triad. And so when they were talking that when the original scholars were talking about that triad, they were saying that it's that simple verse right there with that triad is what they were trying to say might be a shared source. But all the rest of it that's quoted in the Book of Mormon, that is not what they were not saying, and they would not agree that was part of some ancient original source. And I think that was just a slip up on Hugh Nibley's part, because the first time he wrote about it, he did identify that it was just that phrase. And then several years later, when he wrote about it again, it had expanded into more of the chapter. And I think he just, misremembered
Hmm.
because he had it right the first time and then it kind of got screwy later.
Right. Okay.
So I
And that's
think
something that I feel like both either believers, unbelievers, critics, apologists, they would agree about the a dependence and reliance upon the King James Bible, both Old Testament
yeah,
and Testament passages in the Book of Mormon. So I want to come back to this point and maybe just very quickly just get like a quick response to it. I took this from Brian Hale's article, and he talked about like there's no evidence for Joe Smith being like this literary genius, from like going to libraries, reading lots of books. His mother indicated he wasn't as interested in the perusal or reading of books. And like there's not a ton of evidence that he was able to compose long narratives or he had this amazing memory. You've kind of been touching on this with the school system, but what is your sort of quick response to that? A lot of people would say like he wasn't educated enough. He didn't have these skills to just orally compose this very
yeah.
long text.
Well, again, that has a few parts, but when you talk about he has to be this literary genius, I don't think that's kind of an exaggeration, I think, of it certainly isn't my position that he would have to be this literary genius in order to pull this off. I mean, it's a text that has lots of incredible messages. Sure, it has lots of storylines. It has lots of, it's got flashbacks. It has other complexities. But to say this is beyond Joseph Smith's level, and when we spoke earlier about when we want to say, do we have any actual contemporary evidence from the time that Smith was growing up that had any reference to his abilities? There's nothing there that has reference to those abilities. And so what happens is when you go after Joseph Smith has come out as the prophet and also the Book of Mormon, that's when you have a whole bunch of people who suddenly have a lot of opinions about his intelligence. And so all of those no, people are not get what I'm saying is people when you go and you say, oh, look, there's 40 different people who said that Joseph Smith was illiterate. We'll go look at every one of those 40 people and look at the context of that. And it's inevitably one of two things, with a few exceptions. It's people who are trying to say, look, the Book of Mormon's miraculous, so he's too dumb to have done it.
Right.
So it's not an objective description of his skills. There's very much an agenda behind that. And
Like for
then, and
example,
then,
with Emma, when in her final testimony, when she said like Joseph could barely write or dictate a coherent letter, let alone a book like the Book of Mormon, but actually a letter that Joseph wrote, I think it was like in 1829 to Oliver Cowdery, was like it was decent. Whether or not you believe he could have created the Book of Mormon naturally, I at least view that as that's like an apologetic trope to make him dumber than what he is. He could write a letter.
yeah, and that's one, I understand when people try to say, look, he couldn't because Emma said this. But when I see scholars say that, I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Because we can actually go and look at the types of and when she said that, she said he couldn't write or dictate a cohesive letter. What does that mean? she's
There's
not
no
she's not accusing him of being able to spell. I don't think anyone said that he could spell
yeah.
with any sort of accuracy. He's terrible at it, but then so were most other people who were in the common schools, because even though spelling having accurate spelling became more and more important, and it was even important then, particularly among the higher levels like the academies and whatnot. Spelling was really almost a personal thing as long as the other person could read it. I mean, you look at people who are spelling and they'll have the same word in a letter that they spell different ways in the same letter.
Mhm.
The focus on having to have great spelling was not as intense as it is today. But anyway, that's kind of a side thing. Emma, when you look at that, she is emphatically trying to tell people there's no way he could have done this. I would say he and this is where when you're looking at a historical source and you can't hear it or see it, that's when people start to not realize when something was meant to be an objective description of skills or someone trying to say something to that's kind of an exaggeration, tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
It's and I think I gave this example before, but if it's like saying if you look back into the historical record and Emma was describing Joseph Smith and he said he can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Now, in our modern world, we'd say this like coming back and saying, "Oh my gosh, Joseph Smith was so uncoordinated, he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time." Wow, you know? And they don't realize that you're trying to make a point that he was uncoordinated, you know? And you go to an extreme with it. And why do we know that? Okay, this isn't just some, you know, desperate attempt to reinterpret what she said. It's just you just go look at it and you say, instead of trying to read this as some objective statement, you go back in the time and you say, what is it that she's saying? He's so bad that he can't write or dictate a cohesive letter. So then you ask yourself, at what point, at what age were children introduced to writing a letter? And it might be at home, it might be domestic education, probably, um, maybe common school, but I kind of doubt it. But you're introduced to correspondence early, and the ages that they would be introduced to that could be anywhere from 8 years old up to 15 years old. So what she's saying is, and there are some people actually in the Vermont area where learning how to write basic introductory letters was even earlier, 6, 7, 8 years. As soon as you were learning how the alphabet and how to read, write, then you would start to learn how to write correspondence. And so what she's saying, what Emma is saying is she's saying he is so bad. She's saying there's no way he could have done the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And he, he can't even do an introductory writing assignment that kids learn. He's so bad. You know, it's an exaggeration.
Hmm.
But she's not lying. It's not like when someone says, "Oh, they can't walk and chew gum at the same time." They're not lying, but they're just trying to emphasize
This is beyond his
a
natural
point.
capabilities.
This is
Right.
beyond his ability.
Right.
And so that's one of the that and this is tricky. So when you're dealing with historical research, that's you have to know a lot about the context in order to know how to interpret what people are saying. Otherwise, you can walk away with a totally inaccurate understanding of what was said. Okay,
That's funny. This memory popped into my head. I'm not saying this is the same as what Emma did, because I think it's very tempting for us, who are believers in the Book of Mormon, who believe it's a miracle in a translation, to make it seem more miraculous by making Joe Smith seem dumber than what he was. I remember I had a mission companion, and we were talking to an investigator, and he said that Joseph Smith couldn't read or write. He was completely illiterate. And I remember like being beside him, and I hadn't dived into church history, but I was like, yeah, he obviously could read because he read James 1:5 before going to the grove of trees. So I was already like, that's not right. Like, where are you getting this from? I think it was just trying to make it sound even more miraculous, like this completely illiterate boy couldn't read or write, then somehow miraculously produced the Book of Mormon. The only way it could have been is, divine intervention. It just
yeah,
reminded me of that.
that is something that in one of the areas that I do research on is the early American education system, specifically in New York and the rise of their common school
Mm.
system. And it the way people have characterized Joseph Smith's education within that system, um, it is it's clear to me that there are people who either haven't really studied deeply into it or that the desire to make Joseph Smith illiterate is so strong that anytime they look at the sources, they will highlight anything that makes him look dumb. And there's so much more rich information out there that is just totally not introduced.
Right.
But anyway, one of the things I'm coming to, I guess, going back to education, is if someone says, "Oh, it's the equivalent of third grade education," then it's either someone who's just innocently repeating a tradition. And that's the best we can hope for, because otherwise, I mean, that is absolutely false. What he had, it wasn't a great education, but to say that he was just this little dumb illiterate guy is just absolutely false. And I think this is one area where, because people have attached it to the Book of Mormon, um, it has inhibited a really good, solid study of Joseph Smith's education. Um, because, and there's so many wonderful things out there still waiting to be discovered, you know.
Right.
And
Um,
and I think it's unfortunate, but
so I want to move on to some other points, but I just want to finish on this point. So maybe in a couple of minutes, what roughly, how much education do you roughly think Joseph had? Can we even tell, or is there too many gaps in the historical record? And also, I want to acknowledge
yeah.
that I believe his father, Joseph Smith Senior, was a trained school teacher, and his older brother Hiram, he went to that academy near Dartmouth. And was he also a trained teacher as well? So some people think that, you know, Joseph could have got more education from them. I don't know how much of that is we're able to really document. What's just sort of like your quick thoughts on the level of Joseph Smith's education, to what extent?
Well, it's certainly more advanced than most people think it is. But at the same token, this isn't like a university level by any stretch of the imagination. I mean,
Sure.
even if we even if we go back and we say these are the likely texts he was studying from, these are the likely lessons he was learning from, he would still walk away from that, and you could still say he's basically uneducated in the sense that he hasn't had advanced learning, you know. Um, Again, for the same reason we talked before, I'd hate to say, oh, he's at this grade level or he's at that grade level, because it's so different. But in terms of the historical record, there's documentation of him attending school at almost every stage of his life. So there's so he learned his letters by Deacon Kinney when they're still um, in New England. Then when they moved to Hiram was going to attend Morris Charity School. The family moved to Lebanon, that was south of Hanover. And then there isn't a specific statement that Joseph attended school then, but Emma does, or Lucy does say that all of our children who are eligible to go to school, we sent to school. And the starting age of school at that time was 4 years old, and Joseph was like five and a half going on six. So unless they decided, oh, all our kids will go to school except Joseph, we need to keep him dumb because in the future he's going to do the Book of Mormon. you know, that's not what's going on. Then there's a period where they're up around Norwich, across the across the river from where Hiram is in school. And we don't have any documents there, but I do know that there are two LDS historians who, not attacking, and I think the way they worded it, they were realizing they're stepping into sensitive ground, but they're saying, look, we have to come back and look at this period of Joseph's life because, he probably had some schooling here, folks. Don't throw stones at us. But and then so you have after that, then they go to Palmyra. Uh, there are several schoolmates who said that they attended school with Joseph Smith. So you have him now in this period of his life. And then even when they're moving down and they're getting into the Manchester school system, when Joseph is approaching 15 years old, which is about 15 years old is when a lot of students would leave. In the Manchester area at that time, though, there was a really high proportion of students who stayed on at least one more year until they were 16 years old. We know that he was in Manchester for at least one school term because people who lived in Manchester and attended school with him also mentioned him being in school with them. So even though we don't have every single school term documented, we do have snapshots where he's in schooling
And I
for
think when he's
for
down in Harmony as well, working for Josiah Stoll at the Hales after, I think, is it after they
Bainbridge.
stop the
Yes,
treasure
yes.
hunt? Yeah, I think, doesn't he go to school as well for a couple of months there or something?
Yeah. And that, I mean, he's older there. He's like 20 years old
Yeah.
or so. And well, and some people say, oh, he must have been really dumb that he still needed to go to school then. I don't think that's what was going on because here he is in Shenango County in South Bainbridge. He's been hired to look around for hidden treasure, and then now it's in the middle of winter. Um, and what do you do on a farm in the middle of winter? Well, not a lot. There's not much to do. And so what do? Hang around with the Stoll family who you don't know that well and you just got hired and or do you just go with the son over to school and, meet other kids and, I think that, he went to school because it was something to do. But that is another case of where he was attending school. And we can also search the records and find out what was going on in schools in Shenango Valley. I mean, that Shenango County and see the type of experience that he would have walked into, even if it is just that one term. All those things haven't been explored.
Right.
Um,
So you would like to see believers and apologists to stop saying that Joseph had a third grade level education. Like the data may not, it appears like
well,
doesn't support that, or we can't
well,
quantify
I would
exactly how
say,
much he had.
it's not that the data may not support it. I'd say that the data absolutely does not support it. And even though we may not be able to pinpoint exactly what he had, this third grade stuff is not accurate. It's just not accurate. End of story. And I know people will continue to debate that and stuff. I've been thinking about actually doing an essay on that. Not that I have all of the answers. It's not like I could put together a whole book right now on it, but there's enough information to show people that when people are saying he's too illiterate to make it or he's too dumb or this or that or the other, these are not objective descriptions. I mean, they're coming from people who have no credibility to even evaluate his intelligence. Some neighbor down the road said, "Oh, he's dumb as dirt," and probably never even had a conversation with Joseph.
Yeah, because there are a lot
And
of people that called Joe Smith like an ignoramus, ignorant,
yeah,
uneducated, and probably in a way to dismiss him and the Book of Mormon whenever it first, was
yeah,
published.
there's early descriptions of him where they like your missionary companion where they said he couldn't even write his name, he was so dumb. And I remember Colby Townsend had found where there had been a newspaper where someone had said something to that level, and then a distant relative of the Smith family had written in and said, look, he may be dumb but he can at least read and write. I know that because he's part of the family. And and so there's a lot of bashing Joseph going on, both from believers and non-believers for different reasons.
Right.
But ultimately, when people say, oh, this is a documentary history of Joseph that documents Joseph's level of intelligence, that's not what's going on. This is a documentary history of people's opinions about Joseph's intelligence. But we don't the only way you can find out how smart or dumb Joseph was is by looking at the things he produced, not by, Joe Schmo's opinion down the street, whose opinion is probably worth, $2 and a
That's
trip
fair.
on the subway or whatever the saying is.
No, that's fair. And I think, we should look at what's documented for when he was going to school and what it appears that Joseph could do as well.
Yeah,
Here, I have to go pee. Can I just pause for a minute? I'll be back in a minute.
absolutely.
If you need to go as well,
I'll
you
do
can.
that too.
Yeah. All right. Be back in a minute. Okay, well, I think that was quite a good discussion and sort of overview of Joe Smith's level of education, or at least that he was brighter than maybe some uh, friends, some believers trying to make him sound, and also maybe some foes, people that didn't like him as well, trying to make him more dumb than what he was. So I want to bring up a few arguments that believers or some apologists might make in terms of the complexity of the Book of Mormon. And I do tend to actually agree with the apologists as I've done my research into the Book of Mormon that I think there is some complexity to it, and of course there's other complex books that have been created, in human history. But I think they would say because of the circumstances of it being like a creative oral dictation, that some of those things are quite remarkable that Joseph had in his head. So some of the examples, I'll just read some of the things they would point to. is like, all the different plot lines, 200 over 200 characters, three different migrations, three different calendar systems, that there's a lot for Joseph to keep straight in his head, even if he had sort of like a rough sketch outline or notes, to be able to retain and keep a lot of those things consistent. One of the things that I found quite amazing about the Book of Mormon is how there's like over 500 geographical references that are kept very internally consistent. And to me, naturalistically, it seems like Joseph would have either had to have had like a mental map memorized in his mind or some drawn out map. Like I find that quite amazing. He was able to keep it all consistent. That would have required a pretty amazing memory. And of course, I believe we would see it as well, maybe he's translating from a text and they were able to keep the geography completely consistent. What's your view, even under Joseph Smith being a translator, but you believe he sort of studied and had the narrative mapped out in his head? How was he able to
Mhm.
keep all these really complex things consistent in his mind in a creative oral dictation?
Well, I think part of what you want to do is go back and say, what are the circumstances of creating this in the first place? So, and then how do then you build stories within something like, say, a map of all of these places? Now, one thing I would question though, you said 500 place names. Is there really that many?
I think
Um,
there's 500 references, but there's maybe like say over a
yeah,
hundred different places, but there's like different references.
yeah, because I mean I've looked at some of the lists and it seems like no two lists are identical. What people choose to call as a reference. Some places are a place name and some places are just a reference to an area
Hmm.
that's not really a formal place name. The other thing I would say too is you want to be careful, I think, because if Joseph Smith was using the Bible, for example, and just referencing it to do some of the Isaiah passages. A lot of those lists for the names of people and place locations are being pulled from those Isaiah passages. And that's kind of artificially bumping up the numbers, in my opinion, because you don't have to know where they are in the old world. You don't have to memorize anything or have it in your mind. You just have to read off the Isaiah passage and all of a sudden, boom, you've populated the Book of Mormon with a whole bunch of names and a whole bunch of places. So that's one thing. I think if we really want to try to understand what's going on here, we want to catch ourselves if we think we might be intentionally trying to inflate the numbers to make it look more amazing. Um, so that's one thing I'd say. And then the other thing I said about maps and their connections to stories. So if you go back into the process, let's say, Joseph Smith is praying about Moroni told me how Lehi's family left Jerusalem and then eventually came over to the Americas. But I need to figure out the details of what took place. Where did they go? How did they get there? And so when you're going through and those place names are connected to the story, right? So it's not like you're memorizing some disconnected laundry list of place names, but they're being associated with places in the narrative, right? And so if you're making an outline and say it's the departure, then Lehi is at Jerusalem, then Lehi is in uh, the valley of
Lemuel.
Laman or Lemuel,
Aye,
and then they arrive at Nahum. I, do I dare mention that?
you said it.
And then we found our way to Bountiful. Okay, so maybe if you said, I'm trying to plot this out. So maybe Joseph Smith, he's looking at a map and he's saying, Heavenly Father, please show me the way that they did this. And so through the trial and error translation process, it kind of teases out this pathway. And then so he writes the outline. We went to this place, we went to that place, we went to Bountiful. Once you're done with that outline, and if you have that in your notes, you can set it down. You don't have to remember all that.
Yeah, I think the geographical internal consistency faithful scholars or apologists tend to point to is more in the New World.
Yeah,
Like
but
for
but
example, Oh, go
apply
ahead.
the same thing. So let's say that you're trying to figure this out, right? And so you're kind of creating this map as part of the translation. So, when Alma takes off he gives up being the chief judge and he wants to do full-time missionary work and he starts going to these different places. And then if you're there and so you just kind of plot it out, he went to this town, then he went there, and that's when he met Amulek, and then he started to go there, but then they decided to go back. And then so once you kind of plot that out on a map, and then it's embedded in the story and the story outline, that you could throw the map away. You don't have to remember anything of the map as long as you just stick to the story. So the only thing that's memorized then is when you go back to refresh your memory and say, oh, he left Zarahemla and then he went here and there and back again. So the only thing that Joseph will have to remember is whatever those place names were in the specific context of the story that he's dictating in that moment. Because if all of the stories have been connected to locations in a map, you don't need to keep the map and you don't have to memorize all those place names. And
So,
I'll take it a little further too.
okay.
Um, and this is also kind of the same thing with the names of people. Names of people are associated with certain times. Some of the names come up one time
That's
and they're
true.
never mentioned again.
That's true.
So do you that do you need? I mean, if Joseph Smith were in the moment and he said, "Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of this place, but inspire me to give a name," you could even create a name in the moment of dictation and then not worry about it ever again.
Yeah, no, I don't see that over 200 names is a super strong argument because I agree with you. Like as they move to a different time period, it's a different plot, different people. He's only having to remember the key names, in that plot line. Then once they move on to the next one, like yeah, obviously people like Nephi and Lehi, they can refer back to or Liam because they're very key to the narratives. I think I find the geography quite complex, quite consistent to me.
Well, let me trouble it then.
All right, go for it.
Now, this is unofficial. This is stuff I haven't published. It's something anybody could duplicate on their own. And I haven't gone through and actually, this was just kind of on my own, just a quick overview and stuff. So some of these numbers would probably get adjusted just a little bit. But with the geography names, okay, I said, all right, first of all, when you go out and you say, here's the list of all the geography. So I looked at the list and I said, if there's the land southward, I'm not going to count that because
See,
how
it's
can you
generic.
forget that's the whole freaking southern swath of the Nephite Lamanite lands. So it's kind of cheating in my mind to count that when it's like this major southern region or the Northland, the land of desolation. It's like, geez, that's anyway. But I did count desolation anyway. So I went through and I said, okay, those kind of general descriptions of a region as opposed to a place name, I'm I'm not going to count. And then because they're just too easy to remember. And then I also took out all of the Isaiah places that are mentioned because I just think that's kind of cheating. It's inflating,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
No, that's fair.
And then
And that's the
what
old
I
world as well.
yeah. So in the new world, then what that whittled down to was something on the order of 120 names. I'm just going off my memory. And then I said, I'm going to take this further. How many of these place names are only used once? And it was actually the flip side of that is how many of these place names are used more than once in the scripture. So that suggests you need to know that place. Because if you're going to mention it a second or third or fourth time, then that's one you can't just make up and forget. You have to remember that one, right? And so I counted how many place names do we have that were repeated? And then the number was 38.
Hmm.
And then I said, okay, I'm going to take it further because say, for example, when the family goes across to Bountiful, right? There's a Bountiful in the New World, but we have the Bountiful in the Old World.
Right. Yeah.
How many times do we come back to that? Well, it's mentioned like I think 3 times, but it's all within this one short episode. And it's in no other episode anywhere else in the rest of the Book of Mormon. So really, counting that as a place you had, you really only, it doesn't, if you're in the middle of dictating a story and you make up a name for a story, it's easy to keep the name of that story through the duration of the episode and then not have to worry about it later. So in a way, that's kind of a throwout one too, because it can be created, used, and forgotten because you'll never come back to it. So
Sure.
then I said, how many place names occur across multiple episodes? And I'm just going off my memory, but it suddenly dropped down into the 20s. Let's just say 25. And so then I'm saying, not only is this easier to remember, especially when these places are associated with stories, but then the Book of Mormon itself hints at how someone could retain these. And I haven't seen this published anywhere. Maybe someone has shared the idea. I don't know if they've shared it within the context I'm about to share with you. This was like new information.
You should do
But,
a paper on this.
well,
Because
it'll be too
it's a
late.
common argument. Because my understanding, I'm obviously not an expert in this. I've not memorized the maps that faithful scholars have made. But I think the point that they reiterate is not just that there's like say like over 100 different like locations, but they would say like with the references in the text, they would say they're location wise like spatially consistent. Like there's not really any
That's
errors or
fine.
contradictions.
Right. And that's totally fine because if you're working off a map and associating the stories with that map, you don't need to remember all the place names
Hmm.
because those places and their relationships to other places are embedded now within the story.
Hmm.
And so all you have to do is follow those story outlines and it will take care of coordinating everything.
Okay.
But the one thing I was going to get to, and this is kind of related to that, is now we've got it down to say 25 place names. And, that's not hard fast. If I went through, it might adjust it one way or the other. But then when you start reading, especially, and this is like when the wars are taking place with Captain Moroni and all that, they start describing the land in a very specific way. And it's where they refer to in this quarter of the land or in that quarter of the land. These are the events that are going on. So what does that mean? It means in the Nephite conception, the land
Well, they
is
split in
divided
four.
into 4 quarters. So now when you're thinking about memory and you've got 25 place names, for example, now divide that 25 by 4. So you got 6 or maybe 7 places are all you that are core places that you need to remember for each major quarter of the land. And when you have 6 or 7 place names and it's attached to stories, and these are stories that Joseph Smith has carefully spent time working through and discovering. It's not like someone told him the quick story and then he forgets all. This is stuff that he has carefully worked through over a long time. Those core places are gonna populate his brain, even if he's not trying to memorize them. There's those associations. That's just what our mind does. It will start to grab on, and there will be some kind of general map that will be stuck there that's not hard to memorize because it's split up into where instead of memorizing 25, you've just got 6, 6, 6, and 7, or
Okay.
something like
Another apologetic argument in favor for complexity, but also Joseph's memory is in the first chapter of Ether. I believe there's either 30 or around 40 Jaredite kings that are listed in one order, but then throughout the narrative, they're kind of spoken about in reverse order. which is quite a complex feature, but also begs the question of Joseph's memory, how good it would have had to have been, unless he was, peeking at the manuscript, unless he had some sort of an eidetic memory. That seems quite extraordinary that he was able to do that. And apologists would point to that only seems possible unless he had like an eidetic memory, that this was coming from some underlying text. If he was translating, then you can make sense of that. How do you make sense of that, which seems like quite a complex element, which would require quite amazing
Yeah.
memory?
Okay. Now, first of all, I'm going to ask you a question.
Oh
You
no,
just called it amazing memory. Why do you think it's amazing?
because I think that, and I do not have any data to support this,
That's
but
fine.
my guess would be 90, let's just say 99% of people I don't think could do that.
Okay. And so 99% of the people that you don't think could do that, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at this and you're making a judgment call and you're evaluating it, you're basing it upon your experience,
Yeah, sure.
right? So this is another area when we go back to presentism, what we're doing is we're trying to compare our modern upbringing, our modern forms of schooling, our modern forms of processing information, and we're saying this is really remarkable to me, therefore it must have really been remarkable to them too, even though they're coming from a culture where memory is specifically trained, where memory is a big deal in their, it's one of the basis of their entire school system. So that's one thing we want to be careful of when we look at people from a whole nother place in time. um, we've got to be careful on saying what we believe or don't believe from our own experience must be what's going on there. Now, let me give you another, because it's not just presentism, it's also some people might say it could be even a form of ethnocentrism, meaning the way I was raised in my Western European cultural context, this sort of memory seems startling and
Yeah.
unusual and rare.
Because if I were to offer a slight it's not necessarily a pushback, but whenever critics would talk about like the Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon, a lot of them
Mm.
would not just critics, but a lot of people, even some believers, believe that he had to have been consulting a Bible because it seems beyond. They would say that this seems beyond Joseph Smith's memory, but to me, I almost think that's nearly as impressive. The 30 to 40 Jaredite Kings spoken about in reverse order. So if a lot of uh, critics or unbelievers are saying that, well, he had to have been consulting a Bible for the
Mm.
Isaiah chapters, but his memory was good enough to have done that. I'm sort of saying, like, couldn't it have been good enough to do
Yeah.
both?
Well, real quick on Isaiah, I think because there are adjustments being made to Isaiah. I mean, if it was just a verbatim repetition, that would be a lot easier, but a lot of the adjustments are taking place. And not only that, the adjustments tend to gravitate towards italics, meaning someone's making
Sure.
changes where they're visually seeing the text in order to adjust things according to the italics. So I
Sure.
think even if someone could memorize it, I don't think that's the process, because the resulting text has every evidence of someone who's looking at it and then making adjustments that he's then dictating.
Right.
Now,
No, I agree with you there.
so, but I don't, the other thing I wanted to mention about, I don't think he had um, photographic memory. Absolutely
Yeah, neither
not.
do I. No.
And but there's one experience. I'll just tell you one anecdotal experience, and then we'll talk about this just a little more. And even though these are supposed to be quick answers, I think this is kind of an important one.
Sure.
Um, I went on my mission to the Cook Islands and New Zealand, and when I was in the Cook Islands, I had the real privilege of being able to meet people who were heavily involved in their traditions of which were oral traditions. And one of them was the chief of one of the three major tribes on the island of Rarotonga. and another one was what they call the va'atuatua, or the speaker, the mouthpiece, for another one of the tribes. Now, the kings and the va'atuatua, these were people who had to know the genealogies of their tribes. And it was a serious big deal because you're on this tiny island, you have lots of descendants. That means if you keep giving everybody the same piece of pie, pretty soon nobody has enough farmland to take care of anything. So when you had possession of property, it would always go to whoever had the closest claim, genealogically speaking, up to, the original people who arrived in the islands, going clear back to the gods in their genealogy. So one of the people who was a Va'atuatu had a lot of time to speak with, and he was also a member of the church. He told me about how one of the celebrations where this Aotearangi taking place in one of the villages, Aotearangi, where he got up and as the Va'atuatu, as part of this large ceremony, he started chanting the genealogy. And this is genealogy that you cannot mess up because it has to do with land and land ownership. And if you mess it up, they had a taboo or a curse that was common on this. And it's not just in the Cook Islands where they had this taboo. I know it's also in Hawaii. But if someone messed up the genealogy, particularly if they deliberately messed it up, the taboo was a curse that your life would be taken away. You'd die. The spirits would come and they would kill you. And people really believe this. So you did not mess that up. So what happened is they would have these genealogies memorized going back hundreds of generations. And it wasn't just a straight line father, son thing in terms of owning land, but you had to know who the brothers and sisters were, and then who the cousins were, and then the second cousins and third cousins, because you had to be able to negotiate who had the strongest claim to a piece of land if there was ever a dispute. So he got up and he started chanting these genealogies. And you know how long he was doing it? Over 6 hours.
Whoa.
Okay, and this is in our modern time. And he didn't do this whole chant for me. We didn't have that kind of time, but he even started to chant some of these names for me. And I was blown away because that was not my experience. And so my experience in life was that, this was something that normally I would say is just absolutely impossible. But for someone who has been trained and taught in these memorization skills and knows how to do that, 30 names of Jaredite Kings, child's play. You could do that in a single day. And not just the names, but all the stories connected to those names. And so what's happening is when we say this is evidence because it impresses me, we want to be careful because it's not impressive to someone else who actually does that sort of thing.
Okay.
We want to go further.
Okay.
I did actor training when my brain could actually remember lines. I'm very forgetful now. But when I was in graduate school and we had to do a final performance, and we were doing the Duchess of Malfi, and I was cast as this character named Bosala, and he has the most lines in the play. And I went back and I looked at how many words did I have to memorize. We had a 5-week rehearsal period. And then I was given the text before that, around Christmas time, maybe not even that soon. But anyway, from the time of performance until we took it up, I probably had about 3 months or so to memorize my lines. And this is at the same time I'm taking class work. So I'm gonna have to memorize dialogue. I have to be part of scenes. I have to do monologues as well as prepare for this play. And so in a period of about 3 months or so, guess how many words I had to memorize?
10,000.
Ooh, not nearly that much. 5,800. And that is, in terms of understanding how big that is a little over half of the book of Mark in the New Testament.
Right.
And so that's what I did while I was memorizing other things. And so there was a time, and this was a while ago. I looked at some notes to just kind of glance at it again and kind of refresh my memory. But there was a time when Grant Hardy came out. I think Grant Hardy is the one who noticed this. And when he came out with Understanding the Book of Mormon, and he showed this
Mhm.
list, and at first I thought, wow, this is amazing. That's really incredible evidence. And then another part of me went, wow, this is child's play compared to what I saw the Maoris doing. And so I said to myself, I wonder if I could do this. And so I just memorized the names. I don't know if I could do it now, but I could do it then. And I had all the names forwards and backwards in about a half an hour.
The Jaredite names.
Yes.
Oh.
See, because when you're an actor, you're training and learning memorization techniques. And you're training your brain. It's like a muscle. And when people aren't memorizing a lot, they really have no idea what they can or cannot do. But go around and start asking actor friends who are doing a lot of acting. And one of the biggest questions we always got after a show was, how did you memorize all those words? Everybody kept asking us that, and because it's a lot. So tell you what, um, let's do it. I will. I have not put in the time and effort to give this really powerful, detailed thing, but let's do a demonstration instead of thinking about this theoretically. Let's demonstrate it.
Okay.
So, do you have the Jaredite Kings?
Do you want me to get the scripture passage?
Sure. Yeah, I want you to double check my work.
Okay.
And I want to do this in front of people, and I want to do it without notes and see what happens. And if I totally screw up, this is going to be really embarrassing.
Okay. So let's see. Ether chapter 1. Okay. So are you going to give them in reverse order then? Or are you just going to give them in order? How are we going to do this?
Any order. And then also something that you won't be able to do right now unless you make a list is just number them all. Because if you
Yeah.
want to ask me random numbers of who's where on the list, I'll do that too.
Yeah, I'd have to number them. Okay, so let's see. Right. Do you want to do it starting from the first
Jared?
Jaredite King?
Okay, let's do that. All right. And then if you want, you can even take a number down.
Right.
So that if you want to ask me any other questions after that, then you'll be able to double check the numbers.
Okay.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah, don't go too fast.
Okay, I'll try not to screw this up too. Because like I said, one of the reasons why I stopped acting is because I kept going up on lines and I said, I cannot do this to the other actors on stage because that's
So
one
I
of the
can wait. So
worst
you
things.
actually you actually memorized these to test that you could do it.
Yeah, just to see if these claims are so, you know,
Okay.
people are talking about like this fantabulous thing. And I'm thinking, experience tells me that I've seen people who have done just monstrously more than this. So
Uh-huh.
could I just do this list too?
All right.
Right. And so the first one is Jared.
Yep.
The second one is Oriha.
Yes.
Third one is Kib.
Yep.
Fourth is Shul.
Yep.
Fifth is Omer.
Yep.
Six is Emer. Seven is Coriantum.
Yep.
Eight is Com. Nine is Heth. 10 is Shez. 11 is Riplikish. 12 is Morianton.
Yep.
13 is Kim.
Yep.
14 is Levi. 15 is Quorum. 16 is Kish. 17 is Lib. 18 is Hartham. 19 is Heth. 20 is Aaron. 21 is Amnagata. 22 is Coriantum. 23 is Calm. 24, his name is spelled two different ways, actually, depending on which list you're looking at. It's either Shiblam or Shiblan.
Yeah.
25 is Seth. 26 is Aha. 27 is Etham. 28 is an unfortunate name, Moron. I guess we could say Morone to make it sound nicer, but 29 is Coriantor. And then that's actually the end of, well, Ether is part of that kingly line, even though he's not a king at the time. His family's been thrown out. But then Ether is number 30, and then that's the end of the list.
That was quite
Okay,
impressive.
now, well, it's
How do I know you
worse.
weren't looking at the screen there? Have the list of kings up on your computer,
Well,
huh?
I'm not. Can I put a blindfold on them?
Yeah.
Is there? I'll tell you what, I'll put a blindfold on.
Blindfold on and then do it in the opposite order.
Yeah.
And then
And
and if you pull this off, I will never use this apologetic again.
well, it's worse than this because when people talk about this, they say, oh, sure, maybe you could memorize the names, but there are a whole bunch of other names and a whole bunch of stories attached to them.
Yeah.
We can do that too.
Well,
I'll
maybe
give it.
for the sake of time, you blindfold yourself, give those names in
Okay.
reverse order, and then
I'm
I will not. Okay.
I'm closing my eyes. All right.
Okay.
So we're going to go backwards again into this. All right. So Ether, he's the last in the line, and he's
Yeah.
recording everything that happened. His father, or he might be a descendant, but it's Coriantor.
Yeah.
And then before Coriantor, this is where I get Etham, Moron. So there's Moron, and then his father was Etham. His father was Aha. His father was Seth. His father was Shiblam or Shiblan. His father was Kam. His father was Coriantum, and his father was Amnagata, and his father was Aaron. His father was Heth. His father was Hartham. His father was Lib. His father was Kish. His father was Coram. His father was Levi. His father was Kim. His father was Morianton. His father was Riplakish. His father was Shez. His father was Heth. His father was Kam. His father was Coriantum. His father was Emer, whose father was Omer, who was the son of Shul, who was the son of Kib, who was the son of Ariha, who was the son of Jared.
Wow. That was impressive.
And that
Holy
that
smokes.
it's easy to do. If you wanted to say, give me number 12 on the list, or give me number, I could do that. Do all the odd ones, do all the evenings. I can do all of that stuff. And it would take a lot of time, but I could start telling you the stories of what's going on there. Let me do one. Let me do one.
Okay.
So you're getting to the end, and all of a sudden, Ether's sitting back, and there's all these huge battles going on. Who's the king at that time? Well, the king is Coriantumr. So Coriantumr, there are lots of secret combinations going on. So there's just these battles going right and left, people trying to take to the kingdom. Well, one secret combination comes up and tries to overthrow Coriantumr, and they kind of do. His name's Sherrod. Okay, but then Coriantumr's sons they get back the kingdom, and then Coriantumr chases down Sherrod and kills him. Well, that ticks off Sherrod's brother Gilead. And so Gilead, he gets up an army, and then he overthrows Coriantum. And so Coriantumr is out of the way here, and Gilead's up on the throne. And then one of his high priests, the little traitor, comes up and kills him. We don't know the name of the high priest, but now the high priest is the king over this Jaredite nation. And then another secret combination forms, and a guy named Lib rises up, and he kills the high priest. Now he's king, but then Coriantumr decides, I'm going to come back. He kills Lib, and that ticks off Lib's brother, Shiz. And then it's Coriantumr and Shiz. These are the great battles that wind up the entire Jaredite nation. Coriantumr cuts off Shiz's head. He rises up, and then he collapses. Ether and choriantumr wander off. All right. Now, the other thing to know about this before we move on is some of these people have a lot of these names and stories and dynamics attached to them, like Kib, Shul, Omer. They have, that's like with Omer, his story is kind of like with, he had a son named Jared who kind of overthrew him, but then Omer's kids, Ezram and Coriantumr, they overthrew Jared, and Jared was sad. And then his daughter said, "Oh, I can get you the kingdom. I'll go dance for a kish." And then, we'll cut his head off. And then, but Omer runs away because he has a dream. And then, um, so then all of a sudden, Jared's king again. But then Achish is saying, "Hell, that was easy. I'll just behead Jared and I become king." And then, so those are ones that are complex. But then you go to other people like Hartham, for example. He's king. He gets overthrown by some secret combination. We don't know who it is. But then get this, you don't have to know their stories beyond something really simple. Hartham spends the rest of his days in captivity. His son Heth, born, raised, dies captivity. Aaron, born, raised, dies captivity. Amnagata, born, raised, dies in captivity. Coriantum, born, raised, dies in captivity. And it's only till you get to Com that he finally decides to rise up and overthrow the secret combination that took him over, which at that time is headed by Amgid.
Oh, holy smokes.
So for some of
I'm
those
mind blown.
names, you don't have to. When you look, a lot of times people will say, "Oh, this is really fun. This blows my mind," but have they actually tried to do it? And then if you get somebody who's like an actor who's been doing it for a long time, where they have lots of techniques to help them with memory, have they tried? It's not as hard as people seem to think it is.
Well, I don't even know if I should mention this one next on my list, but why not? The long chiasmus in the Book of Mormon, Alma 36. What's your
Yeah,
response to some of the long or complex chiasmus? Because I don't think chiasmus is a good argument for this shows it's ancient or beyond what Joseph
yeah.
could do naturally. Because you got chiasmus in the Bible, some of the Doctrine and Covenants. I think the argument with chiasmus in the Book of Mormon is some of it's long and complex. So what would be your quick response to that?
It's not good evidence. And in fact, chiasmus is one of the things that first got me into scholarship. And because I was so obsessed with chiasmus, I was looking for it. My first publications on Shakespeare were showing how Shakespeare used complex chiasmus in the construction of not just scenes, but plays. And uh, and so in the work that I do with chiasmus, and seeing when there are people who have just kind of produced this chiasm and didn't even know that they were doing it, and you start to look and you start to see different characteristics. And usually the ones where they're specific and they're intense, they're really tight, they're really clear, and it's bang, 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 bang. The chiasmus in the Book of Mormon in Alma 36 does not have that kind of tightness. Now, there is a chiastic structure to it, but it's the type of chiastic structure that I have seen people produce without even knowing that they're doing it. I've found chiasms that are just as long and just as complex in, for example, Andrew Jackson Davis, the prophet of Poughkeepsie. I had an essay where I published some of the shorter ones, but he's got some gargantuan ones in there. And there's no way he knew anything about this chiasmus stuff. Even if he had read about it and were aware of it, he dictated his work the same way Joseph Smith did. He was blindfolded. He dictated a phrase, the scribe repeated back, and then he kept going. And he's got these massive long chiasms. And the other thing, and I think other people have pointed this out, I know Dan Vogel has, is Alma 36 is also a conversion narrative.
Yeah, that's right.
And, con-
Alma the
and
Younger.
co- conversion narratives is one of the traditional narrative patterns in American religious history, going clear back to the colonial period at the very beginnings, where people would share their story of conversion. And every conversion narrative, virtually every conversion narrative, has a chiastic pattern. I was really bad. I started to turn my life around. I found Christ. My life turned around. Now I'm really good. A, B, C, B, A. That's a chiastic shape. People who tell their conversion stories are going to be giving you that without even having any idea what a chiasm is. And then the specificity of it. Now, this is what I tell people. So if you want to think about it in a way to understand, to think about it as an ancient thing, then you might say that Alma, because he was so deeply entrenched in the scribal training and writing of Nephite culture, where they use this all over the place, that it was so much a part of him that he just kind of naturally spoke it, then that's a way to think of it. But
Sure.
if, but the people who say that he sat down and he carefully wrote this out, okay, I can only share my own experience having looked at chiasms across a number of cultures, a number of time periods. The chiasm in Alma 36, if it were intentional, it was badly done. And it just is not, it doesn't have the kind of strict, careful progression of something that someone is sitting down and really trying to do a literary masterpiece. But it looks exactly like the kind of chiasm that occurs when people have spoken one and they're doing it within the conversion narrative already puts it in that shape. But even if you don't have the conversion pattern, when people are speaking and they're trying to emphasize and re-emphasize points, a lot of times people will fall into that pattern. And it's been noticed. People in psychology are even saying this seems to be some kind of natural architectonic of the mind and the way it thinks and processes, especially in oral delivery. So long story long, the chiasmus arguments are I'll just say this: don't make chiasmus a foundation of your faith, because that foundation is not just could crumble, it's really crumbly already. So that's my thought.
Okay. Um, right. Let's see. What questions do I have? So I remember reading through not Brent Gardner, Grant Palmer's book, An Inside View of Mormon Origins a few years ago. And he was sort of highlighting some of the similarities between some of the sermons in the Book of Mormon and maybe some of the conversion experiences having maybe similar sort of revivalist sounding language to what's in the Book of Mormon. Do you see that as well? That the
Yeah.
sermons or some of the religious born again forgiveness experiences, like maybe Alma the Younger or Enos, his sins being forgiven, or King Benjamin's people, resembling what Joseph might have seen or heard at revivals? And anything you want to add to that?
No, I would just say definitely I do see that. I did talk about it. And again, the way that people can fit that into a believing paradigm is understanding that if you have a 19th century translator, that translator is going to be producing texts that are informed by their experiences. And because there's one section in the book, I don't remember the page number, where you could actually cut this portion out of King Benjamin's speech and you could literally plug it into any 19th century revival um, preacher's sermon at a revival, and it would just seamlessly go into it with very few adjustments, except maybe the names of characters or something. It's very definitely there. And then I pulled a passage apart where I specifically said this phrase, and here's where you find it in contemporary revivalist language or contemporary religious language, and it's non-biblical. So they didn't get it from the Bible, but there's a
Right.
whole bunch of phrases that are non-biblical, but those are phrases that you do find in contemporary religious works, and it's also part of the contemporary revival language. So that's the argument for the translation process of a 19th century translator.
Right. And obviously, someone could use that same evidence to support Joseph as an author orally dictating, borrowing, some of that language and
Mhm.
sermons and those ideas. One last argument. This is from Brant Gardner. I took this wee snippet. from him, and I think you'll have a good response to this, but I'll read it anyway. So he talks about like during the dictation session that it's not just like dictating and it's just flowing out, but you dictate, say maybe 15, 20 words, then they pause the scribe, write it down, scribe read it back, and then he would have to continue. So he says that constant interruption of thought would make it difficult to produce anything close to what one might do in a strictly oral performance when that problem is combined with the statements from witnesses that Joseph picked up from where he left off. So when he finished translating, picked up from where he left off without any hint of where he was, then that would be beyond anything I have experienced. What is
Okay.
your response?
Well, what I would say then is the constant interruption. Those are more moments when, while he's listening for someone, you're constantly getting a chance to pause and double check and make sure you're on track. Right. So the pauses, I think, actually help someone stay on track with the narrative. So you say a phrase, and while they say it back to you, as soon as they're done, that whole time, our brains are more complex than being able to just
Almost gives you
focus on
time
the
to think
words.
about what next.
Yeah. So you can kind of, be preparing for the next phrase you're going to say. And it also, the we don't have that how quickly he started on the next line or not. I'm sure it was fast what they do, people just pouring out. But anyway, let me give a better example. Andrew Jackson Davis, who I mentioned earlier, the prophet of Poughkeepsie, he dictated in almost the exact same way that Joseph Smith did. He dictated a book called The Principles of Nature. It's longer than the Book of Mormon. It's like 320,000 words. And he didn't use a seer stone or Urim and Thummim. He had someone did ask him if he could make it work, and he had made a seer stone work, and he said that the powers of making the seer stone work were the same powers that he had, but he didn't need the seer stone. And what he did is, instead of using a hat and a seer stone and holding it to block out light, he blocked out light by just putting on a blindfold. And then he said he would go into a trance. Now, what kind of trance was this? We don't know, because he called his trance like he said there's like 5 or 6 different levels of trance. And at that time, an understanding of trance today would just be an altered state. It could just be, clearing everything out and going into the storytelling zone. That could be what would be called trance. But anyway, the point is, he dictated this 320,000 word text, not all at once. He dictated chapters at a time, but he did the exact same thing. He dictated a phrase, the scribe read it back to him, and then he dictated the next phrase. They would always have people come to observe or double check that there's no funny business going on. And he did that exact same process, those constant interruptions, and he produced this work that, for a lot of people, for the rest of the 19th century, treated as revelation in scripture. So it was the same type of interruptions, the same process of dictating to a scribe, having it repeated, going to the next one. Whether someone's looking in a hat or they got a blindfold on, that's kind of irrelevant. So it's possible someone else did it.
So that sounds very similar to like automatic writing, sort of like being like in a. What's your thoughts on the automatic
Similar.
writing theory? That someone's sort of in a trance state and they're maybe looking at an object, or like you said by that guy, blindfolded, and they're just orally producing text. And a lot of these people are attributed to some sort of supernatural force or element. Do
Yeah.
you see Joseph engaging in that sort of thing? Because I remember whenever I talked with, like, say, Brian Hales about it or did a little bit of reading about it, a lot of people claim that like people who are engaged in automatic writing, similar to what people said about Joseph Smith, this seems like beyond what they were able to do like normally. But then in this trance, they were just able to like have text flow out. Um, do you see
Yeah.
Joseph engaging in automatic writing? Do you see any similarities to it? No.
I mean, there's similarities. but I see the mechanics of the translation of being totally different. Um, Andrew Jackson Davis is different than the people who are doing. There's two things. There's automatic writing and trance speaking, and sometimes when you're reading about this, people will conflate the two. They're not the same. But
Right.
there are a few points that are really critical. Andrew Jackson Davis, in his writings, he let people know that he was thinking about this stuff in advance. He didn't take any notes. No one saw him write manuscripts. No one even saw him write notes of any kind. There's no evidence of that. But he did say that he was pondering and thinking about the bigger questions of life because when early on in his career, he was just kind of a healer, a homeopathic healer, and people kept asking him these questions. So he started thinking about it. And so principles of nature came from him pondering and thinking a lot, meditating, sound familiar, studying it out in his mind, how to answer these big questions that people had for him. So there was preparation. The other thing about Andrew Jackson Davis is different from mediums. Andrew Jackson never said that the words were coming from somebody else. He said they were his words. And he was mad because he said, I'm not some kind of spout that, the universe is pouring words through and I have nothing to do with it. These were his words. And so he was adamant that this was his composition and what was happening. He said that he was going into this kind of trance state where his body would just kind of start to see all the heavens and their grandeur and all the truths of mankind. And then he was composing on his own, describing what he was seeing. And he was going into really complex stuff, really complex Neoplatonic versions of reality, predicting the presence of a planet that science hadn't yet found. He did. He's doing this, and he was young. He started, I think, when he was 19 and finished when he was 20, younger than Joseph Smith. Um, I'm kind of going off on that, and I think I missed one of the questions you had related to this. But anyway, automatic writing, though, that's different because automatic writing, people are not necessarily coming prepared at all to that. In fact, the presentation is that they're not. And what they're saying is automatic writing is someone just kind of slips into this trance state and then they become a conduit for some other entity. And so they just start writing free form, whatever comes into their mind, they write. And then they claim it's not them, they claim it's some spirit channeling through them. Now, some people will call trance speaking the same thing, but it's not. Trance speaking is when people, instead of writing, they would start speaking. So they open themselves up, they're a medium and some spirit comes and then they just start saying everything that the spirit is telling them to say. And so they're saying, I have no authorship or anything, whatever, tied to this. The difference between those two, though, is that we know from studies, and they even did it in the early 1900s with people in a seer stone as well as like these automatic writing. So people told the same story and these are people who believed that they were mediums and they could work through a seer stone or work through automatic writing. And they would tell the same story, but it came out differently on both times. The spoken was different than the written. And that's something in linguists that people have studied. When people are speaking, like we're speaking now, spontaneous speech, and
Right.
the way we are communicating now looks differently on paper because when it's on paper, when we're composing on paper, we tend to write in different ways. A whole bunch of rules that we've learned on composition start to come into play that aren't necessarily part of our spoken language.
Right.
And we might even choose different vocabulary words. We might even have strategies about in spoken word, we tend to repeat things a lot more, whereas in written, we try not to be repetitive because that's bad writing. And so anyway, and that's another thing when you look at the text of the Book of Mormon, there's a whole gob of repetition going on that is so inefficient. If you're trying to engraven this on, there's so much wasted energy in the repetition. And so that makes that's more evidence that makes the text look like it had been dictated from someone who's receiving impressions and going for it that way and not something that comes from originating from a written text.
Okay. I want to get your thoughts on the early modern English, Royal Scouts and
Okay.
Stan Carmack's theory that the text of the Book of Mormon, it's not a 19th century translation of an ancient text. It's not Joseph Smith participating as a translator. And Scouson's obviously an amazing scholar on the Book of Mormon, has read the different manuscripts and editions of the Book of Mormon. But I've even noticed a lot of apologists and scholars have been moving that way. I personally am very persuaded that there's 19th century language, and if it is a translation, it's 19th century translation. But what would be your response that, well, his theory is saying that it's a tight translation, and this isn't even the language or vocabulary from Joseph Smith. This is coming from God onto the seer stone. So that
Yeah.
debunks your theory for dictation or translation.
Yeah. See, I this is a little there are some assumptions going on about so if we were to take a passage that someone had written and then you look at all the vocabulary, you look at all the sentence structure, and then you pull it apart and you do this deep dive in the historical origins of every single one of those words, of every single one of those syntactical structures, you're going to be able to push it back in time because we did not, the English that we're speaking today did not emerge last year. The English that we're speaking today has really long history, and some of the vocabulary that we use just goes back way beyond the early modern English period. And so the argument he's making, though, is that there are certain vocabulary words that, according to the Old English Dictionary, fell out of usage by the time that Joseph Smith was dictating there. And since Joseph Smith, therefore, could not have known this word, then it must have been some other source. There's some problems with that because and I think I did see one of your videos where it talked about how language change happens at different paces among different communities. And when you go out into a farming community, or you go like today, if you go to the Appalachian Mountains, there are certain characteristics of their language that you can trace back to the people who first came from Scotland, or
Right.
primarily Scotland, but England, where there are artifacts of this older language that show up. And it's no longer standard English, but they're still speaking it because there are certain areas that tend to be more conservative in what they preserve from older generations. And so there are some things that we could look at and say, oh, yes, that is also evident in early modern English, but that doesn't mean that the current language community didn't preserve that somehow. It's
Yeah.
so it does it just says that something's really old. But then let me get back to the vocabulary because what people are saying is some of this vocabulary died out. Well, we can't always say we know for sure when it died out. The OED is not perfect. But put that aside, you look at the reading of people, and I mean the artisan class, the working class, and you look at what books were they picking up and reading at home and communal reading at home. And a lot of the authors, John Bunyan, Milton, Richard Baxter, John, I don't know how to pronounce the last name, Flavel, I don't know. But there are a whole bunch of authors from the 17th century speaking early modern English and earlier, John Bunyan. I mean, some of the language he learned was not only some of the language he used in Pilgrim's Progress, which was the most popular book behind the Bible in the United States at this time. He has a whole, it's just chock full of early modern English words and dialect words. And so what happens is when you grow up on a diet of old, older, this early modern, on text that where people are speaking in early modern English, that, especially when you're a child and you're not just reading it, but you're listening to it at home, all of that language, that milieu, that starts to become part of a child's linguistic register. And a register, what I mean by that is we tend to use different vocabulary in different situations. So if you grow up and every time, your dad's reading from the Psalms and you start to pick up, and we do it naturally. We start to pick up the rhythms, the sounds, the vocabulary of a biblical style language. And back then they called it scripture language or Bible language. They had a word for this because some preachers even preached in scriptural language. And so what happens is that children growing up in this time where they're saturated with the Bible, they're saturated with religious readings, and some of those authors are going right back using vocabulary from the King James period and onward and later. That is becoming part of a child's linguistic vocabulary, specifically in a religious register. And so when someone starts preaching or someone starts praying or someone starts giving a blessing, this linguistic register suddenly comes out.
Right.
It's kind of like, everybody does this in the church to some degree. Just, listen to someone pray.
Thee, thy, thou, all this
Yeah.
King
And
James language.
yeah, and not only that, there's certain kind of like phrases that you hear in Mormon culture. Like if you're blessing the food, please bless this
Yeah.
food that will nourish and strengthen our bodies.
Bless the hands of those who prepared it.
Bless the hands of those who
Not their
prepared it.
whole body, just their hands.
Yeah. But see, so if someone were, but then if you turn around and you're out in society and let's go get some food so we can nourish and strengthen our bodies. And boy, bless those, we look at them funny and go, what are you doing? You know, you're using prayer language in everyday way. That's silly. But when we grow up, we have this kind of separation of linguistic registers. And by the way, this is kind of related, but it's another reason. Whenever you see these word print stylometry studies, and you see that this group over here did all this data crunching, and they said that, it couldn't have been Joseph Smith, it had to be Sidney Rigdon, or it had to be Oliver Cowdery, and someone else does a word crunch study, and no, none of this was Joseph Smith, and there's 20 different authors, distinct authors that we can find. Those studies are not taking into account these different registers of speech. And when you're looking at the text of the Book of Mormon, you're looking at a text that's saturated with King James language. And it's a register that Joseph Smith is not using in his letters. He's not using in his everyday speech. It is language that he was using in his blessings. It is language that starts to emerge in Doctrine and Covenants. And so if you go in with this word print study, which is meant to discover an individual style, both through primarily, some people do non-contextual words, meaning a word that's not attached to the story. And it came to pass, you can apply that to any other place or story you want, or contextual words you can do too. When you do studies on that, and those words are attached to formulas, and those formulas are attached to language that came from being saturated in the King James Bible, then what those studies are actually showing us is the style of the translators of the King James Version. It's not Joseph Smith's personal style. And if those studies are meant to discover someone's personal style, then it's a mess. And that's why you get different outcomes every time you have one of these studies. It hasn't progressed far enough to be able to really identify. And I know people will be angry and want to push back, but that's just the truth of it. They're not far enough along to be able to identify authorship for someone who has adopted a religious register that's heavily saturated with somebody else's words.
Okay. So,
I'll get off the soapbox.
no, this is good. So your theory for either oral dictation or it being a translation is very much that Joseph is involved. He's participating, and it's his
Yes.
language, his vocabulary. Almost like some similarities to maybe him being a co-author or like an expansion of an ancient text. Will we say similar to like Blake Oster's expansion of Siri? Somebody might push back that the witnesses of the translation, like David Whitmer, Martin Harris, or Emma, support it being more of a tight translation, that Joseph is putting his face in the hat, the spiritual light would shine, that a character would appear, then he'd read the words off in English, and that they couldn't move on until it was written down correctly and read back. How do
Hmm.
you interpret those counts? Do you think the witnesses they, because I think there's some evidence of names being corrected when they were
Yeah.
spelt a certain way. So do you see the witnesses again maybe engaging in apologetic, trying to make it sound more miraculous? Do you think they maybe saw Joseph correct a name and assumed that's how the whole translation worked, and he must be seeing the words on the stone? How do you interpret that? Because someone might say that a loose translation contradicts what the witnesses are saying about the nature of the translation.
Yeah. Well, what I would say, and ironically, it's what Royal Skousen might say too as well, but with an opposite conclusion, is to say that the data does not point that way. Now, Royal Skousen will say that the data points to tight translation, but I look at the same exact data and I'm saying, no, this points to loose translation. Now, first of all, every one of those witnesses is not actually seeing the stone and the words on the stones with their own eyes for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with you.
So, however, they came up with that explanation, it is secondhand always.
Yeah.
Now,
They could have been told that from Joseph Smith, but none of them. They almost write it as if like this is a fact of how it was done. That's whether
yeah,
or not that's just what they believe, what they assumed or inferred from it, or if they were told that from Joseph. We don't know for sure.
yeah. And then the other thing too is when you look at all of the those statements that they made, they're not all consistent with each other. So I think what happened is people were trying to understand and figure out how this worked. And something that you should know is that at that same time period when, you had these Bible dictionaries that once the Urim and Thummim was associated with the seer stone and the interpreters, then people are trying to understand the Urim and Thummim with the information they have available. And you go around and you look at the religious Bibles, concordance dictionary, well, not concordance, but you look at some of the dictionaries that were available, and when they talk about the Urim and Thummim, then that's when they start talking about how luminous letters would rise up on the surface, and it tend to be simpler. It's not these long, complex stories for the Urim and Thummim, but it looks to me like people didn't quite understand it. Joseph wasn't available anymore; he's dead, and so they read about the Urim and Thummim and how it's described and popularly known at the time as being luminous letters appearing on the surface of the stone, and that they're just kind of trying to make it all work and bring it all together and reconcile it. I think it's possible that Joseph said, I'm seeing words. I think it's possible, but I think the evidence points to improvised language. Um, and when it comes down to it, Joseph refused to tell people. Well, let me take that back. There was a conference meeting. It's a small group of elders of the church. It's an intimate group. These all are believers. Oliver Cowdery is being the scribe. Hiram, after doing an introduction, he stands up and, hey, Joseph, could you tell us more about how, this miraculous work of the translation, how that operated? And Joseph Smith said, now is not a good time to talk about. We're not going to do that. And so you have to stop and think, why? I mean, if these are believers who have already been told that the words are on the surface of the seer stone, it's no big deal. You just stand up and say, it's miraculous. The words appeared on the interpreter, and that's how it happened. Easy, easy peasy. There's no, but he didn't. And so what that suggests is that trying to tell people how the translation actually worked might be too complex to go into. He might have thought we're going into the weeds a little too much. It suggests it suggests that there was more to it than just simply reading off words. Otherwise, just tell them. It's easy.
And all those accounts about him reading off words from the stone and the spiritual light would shine, they all tend to come later, don't they?
Yeah.
After Joseph's death. So
Hmm.
again, this is many years after. And yeah, you would infer from Joseph's statement that if he was telling people contemporary at the time, I'm just reading words off a stone, why wouldn't he he have said it at the elders conference, and
Yeah.
perhaps this is them trying to make it sound more grander, trying to make sense of what else would he have been doing with his face in a hat.
And the other thing I mentioned in the book is just imagine if Joseph, okay, let's just look at this. Say Joseph had this preliminary translation process where he's working it out in his mind, he's getting inspired visions or whatever, what's happening in the ancient world, and he's creating these outlines. What if they said, tell us how you did it, Joseph? And he said, well, okay, see all these outlines that I have? This is what I prepared in advance when I dictated. There's going to be a lot of people going, what?
Yeah, that looks like fraud, or it
You
looks like
you
he
wrote
just made
it.
up.
Yeah. And so Joseph is probably thinking, there are a lot of people who are not going to understand this process if I explain all the details. I mean, and of course, this is me speculating on what's going through Joseph's mind. Who knows what's
Sure.
going through his mind? But I would think that if he were to tell them about this more complex process, there'd be a lot of people who wouldn't understand. So it's easier. I mean, if he did tell people he saw words on the stone, that's an easier way just to, you know, it's not important. Just the words are on the stone. Don't worry about it. Just look at the text and what it brings to you, your life, and how it brings you closer to Christ and how you learn these things. Don't miss the mark and focus on these other, that could be something that Joseph Smith was thinking about. But it always puzzled me that if it's so simple as reading words off a stone, why didn't he just say it then? He's
Hmm.
surrounded by believers. There's no critics. Everybody's going to believe what he says. It's simple. It's not going to upset the apple cart, but he didn't. And that tells me there was more to it than just reading words.
Hmm. Okay, I want to ask you a couple of sort of final in summary questions. Um, so let's just say if the Book of Mormon is not a divine or a translation of an ancient text, um, there's a couple of different theories for Joseph Smith. One is that Joseph is just like a fraud, a con man, deceiver. Some might even think, certain very strong evangelical critics that, he was, inspired of the devil. But then there's like Dan Vogel's theory of him being more of a pious fraud, sincerely believed that he was inspired, sincerely believed in probably a lot of the teachings or the doctrine in the Book of Mormon, wanting to convert people to Christ and maybe try to unite his family. What's sort of your view of Joseph Smith, if not sort of an inspired prophet? How would you view him? Would you see him more as con man, more of like sincere,
Mm.
inspired, believing he was inspired? What's sort of your view of Joseph Smith in more of a naturalistic way?
Well, that's for me, it's really hard to pin down and give a label. Um, because part of the problem is I don't think I understand Joseph well enough to read his mind, basically, to know what his motives were.
Right.
Um, what I have seen from the historical record and reading about the ways he responded and behaved in all kinds of situation is someone who is definitely complex in there's no simple single motive going on behind his actions. Sometimes it's like that scripture says, sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. I think there's some of this going on. There's things he's doing where it's kind of like how I ended the book, and I really believe this. When he had that kind of phrase, "No man knows my history."
Right. Yeah.
I think that he could include himself among the people who did not fully know himself. I think there is such complexity going on that he was constantly responding to his environment. He comes across as someone who, if reality, what he was faced with in his day-to-day living was too difficult to bear, that instead of just collapsing and having reality run over him, he's the type of person to go out and force reality to shape itself to his worldview, if that makes sense. I mean, this was someone who, um, and it's that kind of mentality and complexity that can result in a lot of contradictions, so much that even an individual themselves might not fully understand themselves. And so I think this is someone who, um, there was a lot of there are times, and we know there are times when he was being a little deceptive when he said, I'm not married to multiple women, when in fact he was. There are these conflicts and tensions going on, where other times you look at some passages and you say, if someone were just purely a nasty, devil-inspired jerk, there's no way they would come up with these kinds of thoughts on repentance or Christ
Yeah.
or how to treat your neighbor. That's not coming from a terrible satanic source. So what it tells me is there's a lot of conflict, and he's just trying to move through this world in a way where he, for whatever reason, it could be the very difficult circumstances of his youth and growing up, that he reached a point where he was going to make reality to conform to his desires, rather than feeling like a victim and getting run over by a very difficult world.
Right. I like
So
that.
I don't know if that helps, but I mean, that's kind of how I see him.
Hmm. When it comes to the Book of Mormon, it's set up, in the church. It's quite black and white. It is this binary that the Book of Mormon, it's either true, it's either what it claims to be. It's a translation of an ancient text, and Joseph was visited by an angel with gold plates, and it's based on a history, or it's a fraud, be it intentional or a pious fraud. There's some people who believe in inspired fiction, that God might have been involved, but they don't believe it's historical, and that maybe calls into question like the origin story. But uh, what would you say to those people who maybe no longer believe, like in the Book of Mormon, that it's historical, but what's a way for those people to maybe still see some value in the text? Because I think it's very easy to see it as like, this is like the most correct of any book. Like, this is the keystone of our religion. This is sacred scripture. And then if you stop believing in it, you're just like, this is trash and Bible fan fiction. It could be very extreme. Um, what would you say to those people? Because it seems to me that you have an appreciation for the text and respect that it's viewed and seen as inspired scripture by people in not just in our church but in all branches of the Restoration. What encouragement would you give to those people? I don't think you'd say it's wrong for people to view it that way, but
Yeah.
what would you say about that?
Okay. If someone came to me and they said, I can't believe that this is historical, but my participation in the LDS tradition is just too important for me to leave. What do I do with this elephant in the room, this book that everybody is saying you have to have this black and white opinion about? I would think, and just speaking as someone who now at this point is largely an outsider looking in, but I would say you can look at the Book of Mormon and you can find some really, extraordinary messages in it. And that those can be things that are inspiring. Those are things that I know, there's some passages on, what is the state of the soul after death, and it's brought home to the God that gave him life and stuff. I know that there are people when someone they love and they're dear to has died, where some of these scriptures have brought them enormous comfort and peace and hope. And that can't be a bad thing, And I think that you can look to the Book of Mormon to find things that, I think can move a person closer to the type of ideal of how they want to live, as, believing in faith, Christ, God. I would caution at the same time, because if this is inspired fiction, meaning that it's still coming from a mortal mind, then it's coming from the mental framework of someone who's living in the 19th century, who was whose value system is not going to be quite the same as today. Think about racism, for example, and cursing and the black skin and stuff. And to recognize that those things are also in the Book of Mormon, and to be careful that not to treat every single, and this is where some people would just be angry at me for saying, but I would say you want to be careful because there are some passages that seem to be just as informed by Joseph Smith's own time frame and biases that teach us something that maybe is not really a good lesson. I feel inspired to kill that guy because
Right, like
if I
refi with
don't,
Laban.
my family might descend into ignorance. And because you look at it, I mean the Laffertys, all right, they had splintered off into this radical fundamentalist thing. But if you go and actually listen to the interviews, like with Ron Lafferty, and maybe it was Ron or one of the brothers, but they sincerely, and I don't even know if the one of them's still alive, but I listened to an interview, and it's clear that he sincerely believed that the Holy Ghost gave him a profound and powerful spiritual confirmation that murdering his sister-in-law and her daughter was absolutely God's will. And that idea that originates from this from this Book of Mormon passage. And you look at it, and the angel didn't come down and appear in front of him saying, "Come." At that point, it was just purely, I'm having this strong sensation that I need to cut this man's head off. And there's kind of a long history for me personally of why this is a real problem. Not just because of the text and what it teaches, but also because in some of my own work with sorts criticism, um, I believe I know where that idea originated from, and it was not meant to be used that way. That this is just how when Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon, it came out in this other way in which justified murder, when in fact the origins of this idea was not about justifying murder. And that's a long story, and I probably shouldn't have even mentioned it. But the point is, coming back to it, the there are some lessons in the Book of Mormon that I that for this person who is in the church and trying doesn't believe its history, then I would tell them to just be sensitive to the fact that this inspired work has a lot of human fingerprints all over it. And some of those messages you may want to double check with God first before you start believing it.
Okay. And final
That makes
question,
sense.
I like to ask you about is what do you think we could do better as believers, unbelievers, or critics and apologists to engage for there to be better, sort of more understanding, more civil dialogue? There can very much be this us versus them. I feel like I see it a lot in social media. You see a lot online. Sometimes listening to podcasts where you can sometimes dehumanize the other piece, the other person. There can be some
Yeah.
ad hominem attacks, and of course, there's going to be disagreements. We're going to have different beliefs, and we might come to different conclusions. And often I can see one side accusing the other side of either engaging in dishonest behavior or pseudo scholarship. Like, what can we do better to like understand each other and have better scholarship? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Not much, to be honest.
No, if you don't
Because
engage too much in the sort of apologetic critical sphere, you can try to
not a lot. I
stay
mean,
out of
at
that.
first I tried a little bit, and every once in a while I'll say something, but I hardly ever do anymore. And it's just because I always walked away from that just with this kind of yucky feeling inside, and realizing that whatever I said just didn't seem to make any sort of difference. It was unproductive and a waste of time. Um,
What do you think that problem
um,
is? Like, what do you think the problem is? What do you think needs? to change? Because I feel like I can have a conversation with yourself or Dan Vogel, and for the most part can be civil, and we can I want to try to understand, and there might be questions where it might challenge a little bit, but for the most part, like I feel like
Yeah.
you can still have a good relationship, you can still be friends and have to get personal, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I do not pretend to even have wise words on this, but when I look at what's going on, when I see people, a lot of people who leave the church, there's a huge group of people who just walk away and you never hear from them again. Um, Despite what you hear at church, like people leave the church and they can't leave it alone. Well, there are a lot of people actually leave the church and leave it alone. Um, because I know a lot of them personally who just said, I'm done with it. I'm gone. And they know nothing about what's going on in church world. But there are other people who, um, they have had some really serious traumatic experiences at the hands of members of the church. And I think in the church, sometimes we say, well, we're righteous. We wouldn't have done something wrong. They just got offended, or they just couldn't take it, or they just couldn't put up with the demands. But then when you start to really hear some of the stories and stuff, I don't know how anybody could stay in a church having experienced some of the things that they experienced. And so when some of the people leave, and sometimes they're very angry about experiences they had. And when you stop and you say, what is it that you went through? I mean, from my point of view, there are a lot of people with some really serious trauma that most definitely came about from some really bad and inappropriate treatment of members of the church. So I think if people realize, people, oh, you leave because you wanted to go have sex with everybody, or you leave because you just wanted to drink coffee, or you left me, those need to stop. Because when people, by and large, the people I know of, the ones who have left the church has nothing to do with, oh, I wanted to go sin, or, oh, I just got too tired of going to meetings. There's something else really serious that happened. And maybe it's because they found out a whole bunch of information in church history that totally knocked them sideways, and they feel betrayed and they feel lied to. And those are legitimate feelings. And if people don't acknowledge those feelings and recognize that there were problems, recognize that in the past the church has tried to hide things, and they have. I mean, even the leaders of the church have come out and said so every once in a while. If there's something in faith in history that doesn't support faith, there's some things true about history that shouldn't be said if they don't support faith. I mean, what you're
Yeah.
telling people is we're not going to share everything. We're just going to share what we think is faith promoting. There are people outside the church who say, well, that's evidence of you're not telling me the truth. So that's one thing I would say to people who are members of the church who, if you find yourself castigating or judging or dismissing the concerns of people who left, that that's a problem. That's part of the problem. Now, go around to the other side. There are some people who are so angry and so bitter that they also will engage in tactics of just slapping a label on all of the members of the church as being sheep and not paying attention to what's going
Blind
on and
followers.
blind followers. And that's not helpful. Or describing the church as a cult. That's honestly that's a really heavily laden word that carries cultural connotations well beyond just. That's why in academics, religious studies, you really don't use the word cult anymore, because it's got too much baggage on it and negative connotations that you couldn't talk about it in an objective way. And so they start dancing around it with all these other new terms. And it's not helpful to tell people. It's not helpful to say, oh, you Mormons, you're not um, uh, following the same Christ that Christianity's Christ is. That doesn't help. It
No.
doesn't help to, because, see, I'm in a situation where a lot of my family are active members of the church, and I have lots of conversations with them. And then also, when I was growing up, I was also in wards where there seemed to be, at least when I was in Utah, there were a large number of professors. There are a large number of people who are very thoughtful, people who um, are aware of problems, but they genuinely want to find ways to make it work because that's their spiritual home. And they're not ignorant of some of these issues or all of these issues, depending on who you talk to. Um, but they genuinely are sincerely trying to find their ways through life as well, and trying to be the best people that they can be. And it just happens to be that the church is the best place for them to try to flourish in their own spiritual growth and their own spiritual journey. And 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 so, that it would be nice if both sides could just step back and start to recognize more of the complexity and the things going on. Um, but that just seems to be such a hard thing to do, and especially in today's world with politics, where everybody's screaming and yelling at each other, and I don't know the answer. Those are things I wish could happen, but
Mm.
but I'm probably not the best. I don't have any. Here's our plan. We're going to do this, and we're going to fix it all. You know, and
Yeah,
and
there just needs to be a bit more compassion and understanding, maybe trying to extend grace uh to both sides as well. I think that's what I kind of hear you saying.
yeah, that would be it.
Alrighty. Well, William Davis, this has been a great interview. I've loved this time chatting with you about your theory for the dictation of the Book of Mormon, answering a lot of questions, responding to some apologetic things as well. And thank you so much for giving up your time. And I encourage listeners to go check out your book, Visions in the Seer Stone. And I'll put links as well where they can check out like your academic page and other interviews. Do you have any final thoughts, or will we call it a day?
Just one thing, I am putting together a document that covers a lot of these questions as well as other questions where I'm just
Oh,
trying to,
yes.
because I know a lot of people um, don't have maybe time to just go read the book. And so I'm trying to give a simplified overview of what the book is claiming and then just responses to common questions. And I'll eventually post that on my academia webpage. And so that will be available whenever I get around to it. And then, but other than that, thank you for having me here. This has been fun, and I really enjoyed talking with you. And
Likewise.
it's nice. It's nice to be able to chat without, feeling like, oh no, I'm gonna get clobbered here or clobbered there, or surprise attack. It's like, and so it's fun. In the future, I may do some other projects with Mormon study. I mean, I know I will. I have a couple of essays, one that's under review right now, and another one I'm thinking of, and maybe some other projects. But otherwise, I'm just kind of slipping. I like being a wallflower, so I might just kind of slip back into the background and
Go back
watch
into
from the
theater.
sidelines. Yeah, do something else, Shakespeare, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I've enjoyed this time talking with you and interviewing you, and I think this has been great. And listeners who've been watching, like as well, comment underneath your thoughts on this episode, share this interview, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future interviews. I'm hoping to keep interviewing different scholars like William Davis on different topics. I'll see you next time on Mormonism with Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.
Right.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.